what we know climate change is doing is making how these cold fronts manifest themselves or the nature of our event, changing it and making them a little bit more unpredictable. In this case, we knew we were getting the cold front. We could see that how it played out and the impact it had. You would want to think that there's a little bit of the climate change impact there. In this case, the cold front had really, really heavy winds. And what you want to do is couple the winds with the higher sea levels we are seeing. So climate change is playing a role through the sea levels as well. And so you ended up getting the winds battering the coast with this heavy, and the sea, in fact, coming in further. So it wasn't only the Negril, you remember the Montego Bay as well, and the inundation that took place. So you're beginning to see those kinds of impacts of climate change changing the nature of events. If our climate change is doing is making them unpredictable, but making them more extreme. So not the typical kind of event.
Into it, would love if you
where that cold front came from. I think they said it was a depression coming off the US. From your opinion, your expertise as well, do you think there's a way to plan for things like these, or to expect? Because I know climate change is affecting these kinds of systems, but again, in your perspective, how do you think we can prepare, or do you think it's even possible to predict things like this?
Okay, so I'll probably divide the question into two. So let's start with the cold front. It's not so unusual to get cold fronts at this time of year. In fact, it's typical. How far down they come, because cold fronts really are originating from way up in North America, and we get the tail end of those cold fronts. But the Met Service will talk you through those. And how far down they come, so that they impact us, sometimes is a function of what we call large-scale phenomena. So things like an El Nino, and that we're on the tail end of an El Nino dying out now. So it probably had a little bit of an impact in the how far down. But we do get the impacts of cold fronts at this time of year. What we know climate change is doing is making how these cold fronts manifest themselves or the nature of our events, changing it and making them a little bit more unpredictable. In this case, we knew we were getting the cold front. We could see that how it played out and the impact it had. You would want to think that there's a little bit of the climate change impact there. In this case, the cold front had really, really heavy winds. And what you want to do is couple the winds with the higher sea levels we are seeing. So climate change is playing a role through the sea levels as well. And so you ended up getting the winds battering the coast with this heavy, and the sea, in fact, coming in further. So it wasn't only the Negril, you remember the Montego Bay as well, and the inundation that took place. So you're beginning to see those kinds of impacts of climate change changing the nature of events. If our climate change is doing is making them unpredictable, but making them more extreme. So not the typical kind of event. I say all of that to say, so climate change is introducing this unpredictability, both in the magnitude and how they play out. But you can begin to see the impacts of climate change. The truth is, however, and probably this is critical for us in the Caribbean, there are two aspects to how you deal with that. One is, if we really need to attribute it to climate change. So you've always heard scientists say, well, we can't take one event and turn it into climate change. But the truth is, there's no science emerging called attribution science, which says that you can take an event, and you can see what role climate change played in making the event as severe or extreme as it is. Now, you have to be very careful with the science, climate change didn't cause the event, but climate change may have played a role in making it more extreme or more severe, you know, including, for example, the higher sea levels, you know. But there are other things, of course, at play besides climate change. You know, how close you build to the thing, what's the height of the seawall, those kinds of things. So that answers. So yeah, the science is getting there where we can actually begin to attribute. We don't have that science in the Caribbean yet, and of course it requires data and modeling capabilities. But I want to put in a plug that it's a necessary thing to move the Caribbean in that direction, to develop that capacity, especially because of our vulnerability, especially because of the creation of the new loss and damage fund coming out of COP, which is going to require, if you're going to get, you know, compensation for loss and damage, then you need to attribute, you know, so we need to. And it would be interesting if such an event, which turned out to be such an extreme event, you could figure out the climate change, the precise climate change signal. But we know climate change is playing a role. How you prepare for something like that? Well, what we really need to do, you know, is what we have been talking about, figuring out how climate change is playing. For example, what is the heights of the seas, the return periods of the storms, get the range of possible futures. That's where we're now beginning to model, and then build our infrastructure to match the range of possible futures. We're kind of behind the curveball because what we're doing is working with infrastructure from a past climate. So they, you know, the whole construction industry, architects, they build based on a building code, and it would put in some climate in there, but we now need to update those things for the new type of climate regime. And so our preparation has to be, okay, we're beginning to get this. We know the kind of possible future. We have to deal with adaptation to a harsher climate. You know, so in Negril, we really probably needed to be looking at that seawall for quite a while. I think people have seen, you know, the sea advance closer and closer.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, I heard people saying the first time they ever seen it so high, but I mean, I have to think that it's, as you said, it's over time that this because it happened almost so quickly in a way. It's almost like it's over time this required some attention.
And you can actually look across Jamaica, even the new road in the east, so we just built. If you drive along parts of that new highway, you will see where they have had to build up seawall because the sea is actually encroaching, or they rediverted the road a little further inland, you know. And those are the kinds of things. It's almost like we really have to go around Jamaica and look, what do we really need to retrofit for the climate that we now have, because these were not built for the type of climate that we have right now. What is frightening is that I find, even as a scientist, that the climate change is a little bit faster than even we are predicting. You know, I used last year as a good example. You know, the Caribbean has always talked about 1.5 to stay alive. You know, and that is saying we must reach 1.5 by the end of the century. We must keep it there. Well, last year, for the first time, from February to January this year, when they averaged global temperatures, we were in excess of 1.5 degrees. Now, it don't mean that we hit the 1.5 threshold yet, because you have to be there for a number of years and stay above it.
Yeah, for it to be normal.
For to say that we are at that. But for the first time in our records, we hit 1.5 degrees. No, that is too fast for me.
No.
You know?
That's what I'm saying too about these events is like,
right.
Yeah, I mean, and we do need to, like you said initially, that plug is important, because even I find in my reporting, and I think this might go over into the next question, but sometimes I struggle to platform some of the stories because it's not that the story isn't there and the editors might be interested in the story. They might also have an idea that it's credible, but sometimes when I'm putting it forward, if I don't have, like you said, the data, we don't have a great deal of that, then it's kind of hard to push that. But I do see, and I think maybe this is an indication of the attitude of the government towards this kind of thing, but I do see more reporting on it. And then I do see, politicians like Minister Samuda, who's been speaking more on it. What's your perspective on that? Do you think that they're getting their head in the game now? I mean, compared to, as you said, some of these things required attention from a long time, but them coming on board now, or what's your perspective on it?
So, politicians, other people, I think there's a far greater recognition now that climate change is a real phenomenon. And it's not only that it's a real phenomenon, but that it's impacting our daily lives. So again, you go back to the Grill event, or the Montego Bay, this shut down businesses for a couple of days, suddenly climate, fishermen, but the hip strip as well, the small businesses, the fishermen, the people who are displaced by the roadway, impossible. Suddenly, we're beginning to see that climate change is not just a phenomenon out there, but it's a phenomenon that's affecting mine and your daily life, our day-to-day life. I don't think it's missing the politicians either. I'm hearing some, good sentiments coming out. I think I even read an article this morning where Minister Samuel was addressing the tourism industry, and they themselves were having a conference themed around climate change. And interestingly, they were looking at seawall defenses, and because they have a lot of the coastal infrastructure, and he was making the point that you need to do so. But what we have to do now is move from recognition to a coordinated planned action. And I think getting that gap, so it will require a lot of pieces. One, we talk about the science. It's going to require a strong science agenda. We have to be able to attribute what's the contribution of climate. We have to collect the data so that we can actually make the scientific case. We have to invest in the research capacity. So that's one side, that's the academia. But we have to begin to look sector by sector, almost. That's the private sector. We have to be involved. And they have infrastructure like tourism, but government have roads. And then you're going to talk about other impacts of climate change, temperature last year, heat, health. And then you talk about agriculture, and you have to deal with the water. Water is kind of front line.
Yeah, it's one of the big subjects this year.
Front line. So you don't need everybody to begin thinking about it. That's a kind of a second step. But then you also have to coordinate it. You don't have unlimited funds. And also action in one sector, impact action in another. You can decide on an action in the water sector, and say, okay, I am going to divert water from here to there. That's just, me pulling an example out of the air. Once you begin to do that, you affect where you're diverting the water from, what purpose that water was. Was it a community? Was it going to agriculture? That kind of thing, And so then you also now need coordination. So you need think about it, begin to figure out the actions, then you need to coordinate. And that's where government has to play a critical role to coordinate all these actors. But we have to do it, we don't have a choice.
Yeah, I mean, it's do or die time.
It is. This is the action time. Very critical, as you talk about do or die time. Cops are the major.
That's the next subject too. I mean, you launch right into it. Some of the conversations about finance too, and even with an event like this where, as you said, the roadway was impossible for a while. Fishermen were affected, businesses.
And this was a little event.
Just a very small event. And when the government come out and assessment of damage coming up to billions of dollars, when you think about the stuff, the negotiations at COP and climate funding, what's your perspective on that? Because it's already difficult. We're almost going there begging for funds. When they do give it to us at a certain point, it's like we have to provide the data to show that it's this, and then there are other sort of loopholes that we have to jump through as well in terms of like making sure that again, people know attribution, that people know that it's because of this. Sometimes these funds aren't even funds that we're receiving. It's these are loans too.
Sometimes, right.
So
I think COPs are important. Don't get me. I think they're important because we have to make our voice known. We have to be on the stage because we're the most vulnerable. I think the last COP was important because of, over time you begin to see, finally we're getting some words into the COP process. For a while we had to fight to get 1.5 in, but now 1.5 is kind of accepted and it's in the Paris Agreement. For a long time we've had to fight to get loss and damage recognized. The last COP recognized it and even created a loss and damage fund. All right. But of course, there are the other sides. All right, it's recognized, but it's not mobilized enough. We have pledges of how much, but the actual money that is there is not. And we have had that going back to other funds, adaptation fund, big pledges, but you don't get the amount that you need. But then there's the other side, that Jamaica now also has to develop the capacities to access those funds. If we can get around the bureaucracy of the setting up of those funds and means to disperse them, we now have to be able to, which means, of course, we have to have the science in place for the attribution, but we have to have the mechanisms that when they begin to disperse, we have the mechanisms to accept those funds, to manage them properly. So we have that capacity to make sure that they're dispersed towards climate change projects and that it trickles right down to the livelihood of the person. So that small business that was impacted, that person who couldn't pass, that do we have those mechanisms in place? I don't think so yet. And so we have to work that out. How you make that application, how you access it, how you manage it, how does it filter down. So those are the parts that we're going to have to put in place, but we have to do it now. So parallel to the globe setting up the loss and damage, we now need to be setting up so that we can tap into those. We've been tapping into other funds to varying degrees of success, and then the question is how much of that translates down the line, in the various sectors. But we need to develop those linkages, and again, that's where I say government plays a critical role. It isn't just about going to the stage and negotiating. It's okay. When we get it, how do we make our society better, life better for that person who is feeling it the most, that kind of thing. But I was going to make a point about the action. One of the things that came out of the last COP was this recommitment, the global stock take, how much countries are committing themselves to reduce greenhouse gases. The first global stock take after the Paris Agreement said, boy, the world is not on track for 1.5. People have to reduce the greenhouse gases a lot more. And one of the things that emerged out of the last COP is the supposed kind of agreement that we're going to up the ambition so that 1.5 can still remain on the table. Well, the reporting of those upped ambitions are due in 2026. So not the COP next year, but the 2026 COP. So 2026 COP becomes an extremely important one in my mind because it's kind of the lock-in COP. It's whatever is reported there, the upped ambition is really going to kind of determine the future. So how this COP said we're not on track for 1.5 and you have to up the ambition, and the charge that was given, unfortunately not so legally binding, the charge was given everybody have to up, and that's why they talked about the introducing fossil fuels for the first time, phase down, or whatever the terminology they were very particular in the terminology.
Transition,
transition away, right? Well, I think right now we all have to be very vigilant and vocal to make sure that those ambitions that are put on the table in 2026 really take us to a future that we can live in, that we're not going for the 3 and 4 degree future. So I think there's an urgency now, and that urgency is going to manifest itself. Because if you think about after that 2026, we're kind of locking in whatever the future is for this century for quite a while, for probably the rest of our lives, our children's lives, that kind of thing. And again, that's another role now for all of us, civil society, governments on the global stage, to say, hey, this is our people's future.
Can't fumble it.
They can't fumble it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I appreciate your perspective. So you want to have I think I saw something about biodiversity.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Somewhere.
Yeah, but that, I think, as you said, like, is not next year's cup, or this year, not this year's cup is the one next year.
2026.
Yeah. 2026. Okay, so it's after, one after. But that's what I heard as well, that the cup this year might not be as important as the
one to come.
Yeah, because there are different cups. I think there's one that's happening about biodiversity.
Oh yes. So you have the climate change, but you also have the biodiversity agreement ones. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean that for us, big deal, because those things, not the biodiversity in terms of the fauna and the flora, I think it helps us a lot. I mean, they say we're underdeveloped countries, but these things really help us to offset some of the things we have going on.
Right. The one I'm talking about, maybe I hope I'm getting the year right, is the Brazil Cup. That's the lock-in cup for us. So, and Brazil is a home for biodiversity.
I think it is next year.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's the 2025 Cup. Yeah. Right. It's 2 years from that Cup. So you're right. So that and it's kind of ironic, kind of good, kind of, that it's the Brazil Cup. They talk about last year as being the fossil fuel Cup, because clearly where it was was located.
East,
But now for the lock-in of the NDCs is the Brazil Cup. Yes, it's 2025. You're right. I said 2026. Brazil is known for this biodiversity. So hopefully.
Hopefully we'll get some good results out of that one.
Hopefully.
All right. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, man.